The TV was on. The bottle of cider and the ripped up bits of its label were still on the living room floor. The house was just as they'd left it only an hour ago, but it felt surreal to be standing here now. Sans paced aimlessly in a 5-foot square in the middle of the room, as though he wanted badly to escape, but couldn't commit to a single direction.
I fucked up.
Nothing had been in the trees when they'd checked, and the falling snow would fill in their tracks. There was nothing they could do about the scarred riverbank, other than wait for the snow to cover it and hope no ferry passengers took much notice of the damaged trees.
I fucked up,
Sans repeated.
That was stupid.
No one was hurt. You handled it, Papyrus said, saying what he knew Sans needed to hear and would not accept. He wouldn't have accepted it either. Predictably, Sans shook his head.
It shouldn't have happened. I know better.
It wouldn't have happened, Papyrus knew, under normal circumstances. Sans's control was ironclad. Half a bottle of crabapple cider had corroded it somewhat, and as quickly as he'd recovered, Sans wouldn't tolerate even a brief slip any better than Papyrus was handling his own difficulties.
I keep making things worse.
I'm fine, Papyrus said, mostly truthfully. At least he had a good idea of what that attack actually did, terrifying as it was. Knowing was better than not knowing, and finding out this way was better than finding out on his own. He was badly shaken, and also shaking badly, but he would be alright. Sans peered up at him.
Yeah, you know,
he said.
You took that pretty well. I was kinda expecting to get smeared.
A weak laugh slipped out from between his teeth. Papyrus scowled, lost in thoughts of what could have happened, but he more or less kept himself in check, and while drunk no less. It made him feel a little good, hopeful, like he wouldn't be this way forever. He could almost look forward to practice. Depending on how long the report for the king took him to finish, he could regain some of his former control by the time he returned to his normal duties. He wouldn't have to worry so much about hurting anyone by accident, and Sans wouldn't have to worry about being hurt.
Anyway,
Sans said, through the growing awkwardness.
It's pretty obvious we don't need to be messing with that tonight, so...
He shrugged and crossed his arms.
Maybe you could just call it good until tomorrow.
I'll stay in, Papyrus said, making sure not to break eye contact. A skeptical look passed over Sans's face.
The whole night?
Papyrus nodded. Promise. Guilt gnawed at him as he watched Sans relax and smile for real.
Finally.
Sans reached out to clap him on the shoulder.
You have no idea what a relief that is, bro. Thank you.
Think nothing of it. After such a trying day, Sans deserved a break from his constant worrying, and it was especially important that his brother stayed in the house tonight, given how inebriated he was. That's what Papyrus insisted to himself anyway. Lying was simpler and easier than another argument. The rest of the evening passed in a sort of drowsy haze. Neither of them had energy for much beyond lounging on the couch and half watching the news. Papyrus went upstairs early, under the pretense of wanting to sleep off the cider. Sans, unfortunately, did not. The appointed hour was getting close, and his brother was still downstairs. It was possible that he'd fallen asleep watching TV, but Papyrus didn't want to chance waking him if so. He'd be late if he didn't get going soon. Papyrus eyed his room's single window appraisingly. If he couldn't leave by the door, then maybe... He nudged his computer monitor aside to make room and Leaning over the desk, tried the sash. It lifted easily enough once he remembered to unlock it. Trickier was climbing outside without knocking anything over, but he managed. Dangling from the windowsill, he looked down and gauged that he only had around 8 feet to drop. Perfectly doable. He let go, kicking away from the wall in the same motion, and landed, rolling over in the snow. Not bad at all. Under different circumstances, he might have been proud. He dusted himself off and set out, a bit unsteadily, for the woods. Flowey watched as an arc of bones cruised past him, missing by inches. He could feel the wind of its passing.
"Gee, Papyrus," he said. "You're all over the place tonight. Not feeling well?"
This wasn't the first attack Papyrus had whiffed, and Flowey was well aware why that was. The silly idiot was putting up a valiant effort to maintain some kind of coordination for all the good it was doing. In recognition of this effort, Flowey kept his attacks on the manageable side, just this once. Watching Papyrus stagger around with that look of earnest concentration on his face was comedy gold. "I might be, a little under the weather," Papyrus said. He smelled like crab apples that had met a sorry fate. Why did adults always assume kids didn't notice these things? Papyrus had always been better than most about not talking down to him, or being otherwise patronizing. But even he wasn't without these occasional slips.
"That's one way to put it, I suppose."
Flowey winked, sticking his tongue out.
"I don't see the appeal of drinking myself, but then I'm not a grown-up."
When Flowey needed to distract himself, he preferred altering the states of other people, not his own. Besides, he remembered his father letting him try a sip of wine once, long ago. It had tasted dry and bitter. He hadn't liked it. Papyrus shifted nervously. "Sorry," he said. "I don't normally—"
"I know, friend. You don't need to apologize."
Flowey moved closer.
"Just don't let your brother drag you down to his level. You're better than that."
As far as implications went, it was heavy-handed, but then again Papyrus was firing on fewer cylinders than usual. A brief, mutinous glare flashed across Papyrus's face, but he nodded obediently.
"Speaking of your brother,"
Flowey said, moving on to the main business of the night.
"Who would have guessed he could summon an attack like that, huh? Golly!"
The idea that Sans could do anything the least bit impressive was laughable. Flowey wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. That thing had been cool. Papyrus tensed. "Like what?" Flowey giggled.
"Oh, you know which one I'm talking about, silly goose. Now, what was it called?"
He put a leaf to his lower petals and thought.
Gaster Blaster? What a funny name."
Very funny. He didn't know why, but something about saying that name tickled the back of his mind in an odd way, as if the words were resisting being thought about. It felt weird. How lovely. Papyrus stared up at him, guarded and silent. He was getting better about not tipping his hand at the first sign of trouble. Flowey would go so far as to say he was developing some small measure of cunning.
"Pretty rude of him not to make mention of it until now,"
Flowey said, smirking.
"It would have served him right if you'd let yours fire on him. After all, you didn't know what to expect, thanks to him."
He nodded to himself.
"That would have been poetic, I think."
Oh, if looks could kill. Flowey swayed on his stem.
"I never even got to see yours, friend," he pouted. I bet it's way better than Sans's.
I don't know how to summon it, Papyrus said, taking a step back. Flowey wondered if he'd try to run, but of course he knew better than to try something foolish like that.
Don't be silly. You've done it before, right? So, Flowey said, we just need to jog your memory.
Vines whipped out to twine around Papyrus's neck, lifting him to dangle high above the ground. Flowey gave him a rough shake, watching him struggle. Flowey shook him again, mostly to hear the rattling sounds his bones made. Huh, like a living tambourine.
Nothing?
Flowey frowned.
Gee, this might be kinda hard, huh? Good thing we have lots of time.
Papyrus said, kicking wildly. He clawed at the vines. His fingertips wouldn't have done much damage even without his gloves on, but Papyrus's scratching and pulling let him twist himself into a position where he could chomp down on a vine. The bite didn't hurt, of course, but it did break the surface. Flowey laughed and tossed him away. Papyrus did his best to catch himself, but falling at that speed from that height meant his shoulder roll became a tumble that halted only when his back struck up against a tree trunk with a sharp crack. Snow fell in clumps around him from the tree's lower branches. Papyrus staggered to his feet, groaning.
I want to see it, Papyrus.
Flowey reached out to push him, making him stumble to keep his footing.
Are you even trying?
Spitting out a mouthful of sap, Papyrus balled up his fists. I told you! I don't know how! Was that anger Flowey detected in his voice? Well, progress. Flowey shoved again, knocking Papyrus to his knees.
Sans got to see it, he said. I'm feeling very left out. Aren't I your best friend?
An hour passed in this way. Papyrus hit the ground for the umpteenth time with a frustrated huff. He scrambled upright again, grumbling. It was a welcome change from his habitual shaking and snivelling, though in all fairness that had been tapering off more and more. Fear was now shot through with anger, far more productive, and on Papyrus, far more amusing. He was cute when he was angry. It was like being growled at by a puppy.
Let me see it, friend.
Papyrus glared up at him. I'm trying. Flowey giggled. If anger was the key, he had to accept getting yelled at a few times. But he found he didn't really mind. Papyrus was so funny. He even stamped his feet now and then, like he couldn't think of a better way to vent his aggression despite having all that magic at his disposal. But despite how much fun Flowey was having teasing him, the night wouldn't last forever. He really wanted to see that attack. He'd seen Papyrus really pissed off once before, and he wasn't quite there yet.
Maybe you're right after all, Flowey said. Maybe you really can't do it by yourself. Maybe we need to ask for help.
Papyrus blanched. No, he stammered. I can do it. I just need a moment. Flowey pretended not to hear him.
I bet your brother can explain it right. Why don't I just go and get him?
No, don't!
What's that word I hear, Papyrus? Be careful,
Flowey cautioned. Papyrus cringed back, hands raised in front of him. Just...
That's right, Papyrus.
Flowey grinned.
I'm going to go to your house, and I'm going to drag Sans out of whatever window is the most convenient. And we're going to come right back here and get this mental block of yours all straightened out. I bet he'll be so happy to not be utterly useless for once.
He moved, as if to leave the clearing. Papyrus darted in front of him, blocking the way with a wall of bones. He said nothing this time, wild-eyed and quivering.
You silly! Flowey laughed. As if you can stop me.
He started to pull himself below ground.
I'll say hi to your brother for you.
Faster than he could blink, a beam of raw magic punched through him, bright and colder than death. It was spent in a second, but it more than made up for every bit of damage Papyrus had failed to deal thus far. When the beam faded, past the dazzled spots floating in Flowey's vision, he could make out the shape of a large beast-like skull hovering over Papyrus, like a wrathful mother over its child. It seemed to stare into and through him with its empty eye sockets while it closed its massive jaws. Implacable, unfeeling, and lethal. It was the most glorious thing he'd ever laid eyes on. Who would have thought Papyrus had it in him? So many new things in one day. This run had been his best idea ever, no matter what became of it in the end. He hadn't been this entertained in a long time. Secret magic and words that wouldn't stay in his brain, and Papyrus, of all monsters, looking like he really could take down a human. Whatever happened, it would be an ending Flowey had never seen before. The possibilities were intoxicating. Papyrus fell to his knees, woozy from the quick drain on his magic. The skull dipped down as if to shield him even as it began to dissipate. And then it was gone, showering its master in spent magic. Flowey's scorched body and the area of steaming mud around him were the only evidence it had existed at all.
See, Flowey said brightly, I believed in you all the way.
He drew close, crackling as he moved. Burnt leaves and charred bits of stem fell from him, leaving a trail. Shivering with exertion, Papyrus struggled to focus on Flowey's face.
Are you...
he said, teeth chattering.
Are you all right?
Sweet, simple Papyrus. For a few brief moments, he looked like a proper human hunter, even without the armor. His blaster would be embarrassed if it were still present, and capable of thought.
I'm more than all right, friend. You did very well.
Flowey patted the skeleton's cheekbone with a crispy leaf.
Tired,
Papyrus stuttered. He was shaking hard enough to rattle. Clearly, there would be no repeat performance tonight, no matter how riled Flowey got him. Flowey hummed.
Well, I suppose we can take a break. You have just made a major improvement, after all.
Nodding, Papyrus shifted to sit fully on the ground. Flowey curled loosely around him, feeling him tense up.
Easy, friend. We're just hanging out, Flowey said. You've had a pretty heavy day, huh?
He tightened his coils briefly in a hug. Papyrus sat stiff as a statue.
It must be hard having to deal with such a high-maintenance person all the time. Sans really shouldn't lean on you so much.
Stock still except for his shivering, Papyrus stared off at the mud patch the blast had melted into the snow.
That was pretty awesome,
Flowey said, following his gaze.
I bet a human would sizzle right up after something like that,
he giggled.
You're getting so strong.
He gave Papyrus another light squeeze. Positive reinforcement was important too. His favorite toy seemed to be out of batteries for the night. Minutes ticked by as Flowey kept up a one-sided conversation. Papyrus said nothing in reply and, in fact, gave no indication he even heard Flowey speak. Oh well. Flowey had already gotten what he wanted, for now. The walk back home was long. More than once, Papyrus had to sit and rest for a few minutes before continuing on. Catching his reflection in a patch of ice, he winced at the picture he presented. The shaking would hopefully subside by the time he reached Snowdon, but he couldn't do anything about the rest of it. His clothes were damp and grimy from tumbling through the snow, and he could feel a rip in the back of his shirt from his close encounter with that tree trunk. That, and the fact that he was scuffed up and barefoot combined to make him look like some manner of drifter. It was with a sense of profound relief that he crossed the bridge into town. They'd finished early. He'd been unable to do any magic after... And so after sitting together quietly for a while for reasons Papyrus couldn't fathom, Flowey had let him go. Maybe he'd have time to shower and have something of a proper nap before Sans got up. That would be nice. His feet were sore, and his back hurt a lot. His whole body ached, in fact, and he was certain his skull would fall right off his neck and shatter on the ground if he moved it too fast. He wondered if it was magical exhaustion, or if he'd finally managed to achieve a hangover. Perhaps both. He walked through the silent town in a daze. The sooner he was home, the happier he'd be. He wanted rest, and then he wanted to keep busy. He had a lot to avoid thinking about. Painfully bright light and a subsonic thrum that was more physical sensation than sound played through his head, over and over. Torrential magic, like a dam had burst somewhere inside him, had siphoned off every scrap of strength his soul could spare in an instant. If that night on the hill when his magic had run wild could be compressed into a few seconds, Papyrus imagined it would have felt just like that. It had been so strong, so alien, and yet so perfectly tuned to his soul. It had frightened him. The stink of burnt vegetation lingered in his nasal cavity even now. He stopped short in the road. Sans was sitting on the front step of their house, watching him.
Yeah,
Sans said, hoarse and tired-eyed.
That's what I thought.
Papyrus stood there stupidly, saying nothing. Sans rested his head in his hand, face expressionless but pinched.
Out for a nice walk? Do you know,
he said,
that I've been up all night? Same as you, I bet.
This was bad.
Sans, just save it, Papyrus.
Sans sounded more tired than angry, but then again he sounded very tired.
I went to check on you since, we had a lot to drink and I wanted to make sure you were okay.
He gestured, spreading his hands.
And lo and behold, bed's made. You're not in your room. You're nowhere in the house. You know what was in the house, though? Your phone.
Reaching into his pocket, Sans pulled out Papyrus's phone. He tossed it and Papyrus nearly missed the catch, too tired and achy to move very fast.
And you know how relieved I was when I heard it ringing. I figured you must have just ducked out for a few minutes, and I was overreacting. And then it just kept on ringing and ringing. You left it on the kitchen counter.
Unsure whether speaking or keeping quiet was the wiser option, Papyrus spoke. I'm sorry. I must have misplaced it. Sans exhaled sharply.
That phone hasn't left your side longer than it takes to charge the battery since you got it.
Papyrus really honestly had simply forgotten his phone. He dearly wished he hadn't. If he'd been just a little more careful.
Anyway,
Sans went on, still staring him down.
I'm getting pretty worried by now, right? So, I started looking around outside, and I noticed tracks behind the house. Did you seriously climb out your window?
He chortled at that, slapping his knee as though hearing a good pun. His laugh was like sandpaper.
After everything that went down yesterday, after you promised you'd stay, you fucking vanished again. You went out of your way to sneak out like a goddamn teenager, and you lied right to my face.
Going another round with Flowey would have been preferable to this. Sans wasn't even yelling. Papyrus hadn't seen him this upset in years. "I'm sorry," Sans shrugged.
That's so. Because I think you'd have slipped back in the house and played it off like you'd been here the whole time if you could. If you were sorry, you'd stop pulling this shit.
He looked Papyrus over, from top to bottom.
Yesterday's clothes, no shoes even, and you look like you took a walk off a cliff.
Papyrus made a helpless gesture. He could think of no good reason for him to look this way, none that his brother would believe.
You weren't at that hill either, Sans said. I checked. Didn't time myself, so, sorry about that.
His grin took on a bitter edge.
And I can't very well search the whole forest, so I decided to keep a lookout here in case you came back. Only had to wait 3 hours.
Unable to meet Sans's gaze, Papyrus looked away. He didn't know what to say to make Sans even slightly less angry with him. He'd really stepped in it this time.
3 hours of feeling like a moron for taking you at your word, when that used to be one of the only things I never had to question.
Sans's voice shook.
3 hours of wondering where you went this time, and why, and knowing I wouldn't be able to find you if anything happened to you. Do you have any idea,
he said,
what that feels like?
I'm sorry, Papyrus said again. It was completely inadequate, but it was all he had. Sans stood up, and Papyrus couldn't help flinching back at his approach. Sans frowned at his reaction, and circled him, studying him with an air of judgment.
I mean,
he said,
is this some kind of mania or something? You can't skip it for one night?
He stopped directly behind Papyrus, no doubt looking at his torn shirt.
How the fuck did you get a chunk of bark stuck in your spine?
Before Papyrus could think up an answer, Sans took hold of the offending tree bark and yanked it out. Papyrus yelped.
It's chipped,
Sans said, feeling with his thumb along the process of one of Papyrus's vertebrae. It stung. Sans circled back around to shove the bark in Papyrus's face. It was a sizable piece. Sans couldn't close his fist around it.
What the hell are you doing? Why are you hurting yourself?
It was just an accident, Papyrus said. I messed something up.
Yeah,
Sans said.
You messed up your fucking back. And if you'd really got hurt, how long would you have been lying out there before someone found you? If anyone ever found you?
He winced at his own raised voice. Papyrus looked down at the ground. I didn't mean to worry you.
Really? Because you're getting pretty pro at it.
Sans's voice cracked. He scrubbed at his eye sockets with his sleeve, sucking in a deep breath.
At least tell me where you went.
Papyrus crossed his arms, disgusted with himself but resolute. He couldn't give his brother that information. Coming up with a fake answer was as bad as refusing to answer at all, if not worse. Sans would see through the lie now that he was expecting one. Sans threw the piece of bark as far down the road as he could with a choked yell.
You know what? Fine.
Shoving his hands in his pockets, he knocked roughly against Papyrus with his shoulder as he stormed past. Where are you going? Papyrus asked, letting the momentum of the hit turn him around.
The inn,
Sans snapped without looking back.
I'm tired. Do me a favor and stay away from me for a while.
Papyrus watched him go, wanting to call after him or follow him or just stop him somehow, but it wouldn't do any good. He stood there for several minutes after Sans was out of sight, then let himself inside. He forced himself to get cleaned up, though he wasn't looking forward to any part of the day anymore. His chipped vertebra and his many scrapes stung under the spray of the shower, but he took his time, making sure that every last speck of dirt and plant matter was gone and all the snow and ice was melted away. Once that was done, he stood there until the hot water turned dead cold. The water did a good job of camouflaging any tear tracks that happened to be on his face, not that there was anyone in the house to see them. Too tired for anything else, he settled down to try to sleep. He shifted uncomfortably for a few minutes before flopping over onto his front to take the pressure off his injured back. His mind churned, keeping him awake despite his exhaustion. It was as though each problem was fighting over his attention, trying to outdo one another. That attack, the blaster, needed to be dealt with. As much as Papyrus would rather have forgotten all about it, there was no going back. Whatever had triggered its appearance in the first place, it wasn't going to go away, just as Sans had said. Flowey had goaded it out of him easily, and yet he still wasn't sure how he'd summoned it. Papyrus sighed into his pillow, trying to think. He remembered getting increasingly upset and afraid while Flowey tossed him around like a rag doll. That was a feeling he'd become used to. It no longer held much of an edge, but threatening Sans, and it had been a threat without any doubt. That had sparked a kind of frantic, helpless anger that overrode conscious thought. That was something Papyrus had never in his life had much occasion to feel, until recently. That was rage. Rage that had burned hotter than it had that night on the hill. Papyrus didn't know what came between him feeling that way and the blaster existing. It happened so fast. All he could recall was a strange sort of reverberation, as though his soul had cried out, and something answered. Something came. He wondered briefly if Flowey would be alright. He hadn't seemed fazed at all, but then again he didn't really feel pain. Not that it made it okay to injure him, but... Not long ago, Papyrus wouldn't have continued that thought with a but. It wasn't okay to hurt someone, no matter what the circumstances. Shame rolled over him in greasy waves. The word clung to him regardless, refusing to be shaken off. Flowey was just a child, but Flowey had suffered violence and cruelty that no one, and especially not a child, should ever have to endure. But he had been denied even his final rest, trapped in a strange form and slowly unraveling in loneliness and despair that Papyrus couldn't begin to imagine. But all monsters told of the little prince they'd lost, who had been every bit as gentle and warm as his parents. He had once been kind. He had once been good. But he'd threatened Sans. Papyrus ardently believed that there was no such thing as a purely evil person. There was always a reason why someone left the narrow path, some underlying wound that could conceivably be healed. Anyone could be good if they tried, if they were given hope for atonement and forgiveness. Papyrus believed this with his whole being, and always had, and always would. Flowey had been good once, and Papyrus truly felt that he could be so again, no matter how twisted and cruel he'd become as time passed, and he lost more and more of himself. But In the moment that Flowey had been leaving the clearing, leaving for Snowdin, Papyrus hadn't cared about any of that. In that moment, he just wanted his brother safe, no matter what. Papyrus would stake his life on his belief in the power of mercy. He couldn't gamble with Sans. Sans. Siblings fought. That was an immutable fact of nature. Siblings that worked together, lived together, that had more or less raised each other fought, if anything, more often than average. Papyrus knew he could grate on Sans's nerves, and Sans routinely crossed the line from funny to infuriating. They'd done their share of screaming at each other over the years. This morning had been different. This morning had felt like something irreversible was happening. Sans knew he was being lied to, that Papyrus was throwing all attempts at help back in his face. Papyrus had heard his deepest hurts, and had, from Sans's perspective, simply nodded along and tossed them aside. That betrayal must have cut deep. Being brave and honest had done Sans no good. No matter what he said or did, it would never be enough to get through. Papyrus could never allow it. The price was much too high. If Sans started to resent him, Papyrus would understand. Papyrus wouldn't blame him if he gave up on trying to help altogether. As long as he was safe, nothing else really mattered. No matter how much it hurt. Papyrus wasn't sure when he'd finally fallen asleep, but he woke to a headache that made him regret waking up, along with other bad decisions he'd made in his life. Decisions like drinking all that cider the day before and, going back a little further, ever being born. If he was careful to lie perfectly still, it only hurt immensely instead of extremely, but he couldn't stay in bed all day. With slow, considered movements, he managed to get on his feet. He got himself a glass of water and returned to his room. Sans was still out. Papyrus doubted he'd see him at all until tomorrow. No use thinking about that now. Sipping the water slowly, Papyrus booted up his computer. 2 days in, and he hadn't made much progress on Undyne's, now his, reports. He had a dreadful headache that would be made worse by reading, but there was no helping it. It was going to be a long, miserable afternoon. After a dozen reports that took far too much time, Papyrus was forced to admit defeat. He couldn't see straight. Even the screen was doubled. The desk chair was hitting in just the right spot to aggravate his back, too. This was going to take ages without help. And the longer it took, the longer he'd have these nightly practices, and the more he'd alienate Sans. What was that acronym Alphys always added when she was venting? He didn't know what the letter stood for, but he was sure it applied. FML, he sighed.